So how many people went up in number? How many people stayed the same in number? Okay, so everybody at least stayed the same or got better. And that was only 3 minutes. 3 minutes actually isn't enough time to have a lot of impact doing this. The minimum recommended is about 15 minutes. But even in that amount of time, a room that wasn't generally stressed out to start with saw an improvement. And I know I've done this myself personally and with other people where I've been like almost at the bottom, like number 1 or 2 on this. Few minutes in, halfway up the scale. Another few minutes up to number 7 or 8. It works really, really quickly. And as I said, we had clients that they start to call me up, can we do it now? And I'm like, yeah, you can do it on your own. You don't need me. So imagine the impact that would have on a workforce that is having, you know, this kind of stuff on a regular basis. How quickly that resets. And as you know, what Mike went back to the neurology, how that will change the behavior and the thinking and how people interact with each other and the ability to find creative solutions. So we had another client that we did this with, and the change in the way that team worked together was their manager told me hands down the best teamwork building activity that they'd ever done. So there tended to be a lot of dissension. People were under a lot of pressure, and they tended to have their own solutions. They're like, this is my idea. Like they had a lot of ownership over the ideas. But as a group, they weren't sharing those ideas with each other, and they're being competitive between whose idea got to move forward. And they started doing this technique together and a few other techniques that we do. Within a few weeks, they started speaking to each other differently. They started working. People in the group that never really got along started to be friends. So it was really an interesting dynamic, what we're capable of doing when we get out of that, what we call the stress response, but also the overwhelm, anger, frustration. The lower numbers on this scale, we actually become different people, and we act differently when we get into those higher zones. So on this scale, where do you think the high performance zone is? Anyone?
Once you get beyond 7.
7's sort of the minimum. 8, 9, and 10 are really the high performance zones. Where, you know, that first client who I shared his story earlier, who luckily was able to turn things around and go from being pre-diabetic, work on the stress response, he was in the lower part of this scale the majority of the time. When he was performing high, he was 9 and 10, almost exclusively. He rarely dipped below 9. And through learning some techniques, he was able to get back to that. So in his story, fortunately, he was able to, you know, get back to working those less hours. He was able to get back to number 1 in sales. He was able to get back to not only number 1 in sales, but getting promoted and becoming sales manager. And his health returned. He dropped 65 pounds in about 6 months, back to his normal weight. No more gout, no more diabetes. And he's been able to stay clean ever since, and he's in his 40s now. And he doesn't, you know, just those simple lifestyle changes. And of course, he now has regular breath practice technique in addition to the exercise. And he wasn't going through those drive-thrus anymore. He wasn't going for the caffeine and the quick fixes because his body didn't need it. He just didn't need it. And, you know, his ability to work with others went back to where it was before. And then he was back up to number 1 in sales, and then they made him sales manager. So this stuff works very easily and very quickly. So imagine the impact, you know, it can have. So I just want to take you through on here why this is so important. If you're in a society where Mike showed that, you know, 60% of the people have this to some degree to the point that it's impacting them, that's more than half. If you get rid of the stress, the way I just explained to you with this example, this client I had, He was their number one salesperson, developed bad habits. So he was dropped to 1/3. That was a 50% drop for him in sales. And if you had a whole workforce that was doing that, and then he got it back up to where he was capable of doing, in companies that we've done this in, they've seen 20 to 70% increase with no additional hiring. They start to find better ways to do things. So you stop the stress, increase profits, lower costs, better thinking, happier. I mean, there just aren't a lot of negatives to doing this. It's win-win-win on multiple situations. So at the end, Mike is going to share with you some ways that if you want to investigate this further, if you want to say, hey, what's really happening in my organization? Because unfortunately, one of the biggest challenges that we're seeing with the stress thing is that there's some, like my client, he can't admit it. There's a stigma to admitting it. He was worried about losing his job if he said something. But it's up to us as the leaders to recognize what's going on even when people aren't speaking up, because the health costs are speaking up. The missed days at work are speaking up, and the mistakes are speaking up. That's where we find those numbers. So at the end, Mike's going to share some ways that you can take a deeper dive in your own organization to see what's going on. And I'm going to pass it off now to Brad, who's